I feel very, very much elated when someone gives me an opportunity to go back to my role as a teacher, which is actually, I consider to be my primary role. So therefore, it is a relief from me, from the administrative pressures. Here I am on my own. In fact, you must have noticed the students, I'm just speaking for the students exactly. The students must have noticed that I have created a huge background, not huge actually, at least a very elaborate background. But why? In fact, you know, every year I sit for the College Service Commission interview as an interviewer, and there, nowadays I feel very, very surprised when very simple questions we ask that they are not able to answer. That means somehow there is a failing in our teaching process, that we do not give them the proper background through which they can prepare themselves for such things. I have a mind at a later stage to conduct sessions on such backgrounds, central topics which will be relevant for them in this regard. However, while considering John Donne, I have first of all tried to give you a basic pattern of life. In fact, I don't really give much time for life because students themselves can read about it. But I pick on certain specific facets of their life which are important for understanding their poems. I'm not interested in the year in which he was born, in the school to which he went, etc., etc. I'm not interested in those bare details, but I'm interested even in their background of going to school, if that contributes to our reading of the poem. So I talked about the basic pattern of life very briefly in my last class. And I have also talked about the personal crisis and apostasy. What is this apostasy? Apostasy actually refers to the departure from one established faith or religion to another. And this happened as far as John Donne is concerned, creating thereby a distinctive personal crisis. In fact, you know, he belonged to a Catholic family, and I talked about that in detail in my last class. The whole family actually was tortured because of their Catholicism. I told the students here in my last class that being a Catholic was a terrible situation in England at that time, not only in the 17th century, but also in the 18th century, and it started for a long time, since the reign of King Henry VIII. I talked about that, and how he was tutored by a private tutor, and then I talked about the crisis that he encountered because of this. And finally, this apostasy somehow helped him, but it also created, professionally it helped him, that he left Catholicism and went to the Anglican faith, but that created a psychological horror, the horror of transformation, which you will notice in the holy sonnets of John Donne, in poem after poem, in sonnet after sonnet. You will see this tension and anxiety. It's all because of this apostasy. And I will today begin with the fatal marriage very briefly. And this also will create a lot of anxiety and tension in John Donne. We know that, first of all, he moved away from his Catholic identity, and this helped him professionally. And then he got an opportunity to join the expeditions under the commandment of the Lord of Essex for the battle against the Spanish forces. This was an honor, that he got the opportunity to join the forces under the command, under the direct commandment of the Earl of Essex. Now, it was the expedition was a failure, but that is not important. But it was a successful endeavor on behalf of John Donne, because he came to be favored by the Earl of Essex. So therefore, it is in this way that he came closer to the nobility. And this leads to his appointment. So, as I say, that it brought him close to the nobility, and this led to his appointment as chief secretary to one very important noble person. His name is Sir Thomas Egerton. Sir Thomas Egerton, he became the chief secretary. And it is in the household of Egerton that he came to be intimate with Anne More, A-N-N, Anne More for the students, M-O-R-E, Anne More. She was the daughter of Sir George More, who was acting as a lieutenant in the Tower of London. So Sir George More was acting at that time as a lieutenant of the Tower of London, very important position, and his daughter Anne More was staying in the household of Egerton. And they fell in love. John Donne and Anne More fell in love with each other, and they married secretly in 1601. And the moment it came to light, Donne was summarily dismissed from the service of Egerton. And after this dismissal, John Donne very wittily wrote, John Donne, Anne Donne, undone. John Donne, Anne Donne, undone. However, I'm not going into the details of many of such things, but it is true that he had to lead a very troublesome life because of this, and he was not really able to get any service. এবং একটা জিনিস বলে রাখছি যে এগুলো বলার কারণে এইটাই, because all of these actually come to be ultimately reflected in his poems. And finally, there was a change in 1611. His life of poverty was radically changed by Sir George Moore's change of attitude. His attitude softened, and he decided to pay a dowry of £800 per year for his daughter. And at that time, £800 per year was quite lucrative. Moreover, he came to be very friendly with the Countess of Bedford. And as a result, things began to be changed. And I'm not going into all such details, but finally, he also got the position of a preacher. He was appointed, appointed to the post of a preacher. And later on, he became the Dean of St. Paul's. So it is in this way that we find that he came to be gradually very important, but his wife silently bore all the pangs and penuries and died in 1617 at the age of 33. Donne's career shows two distinctive phases of anxiety. Since his marriage with Anne More in 1601, he suffered from a terrible phase of emotional crisis, which, as his biographer Walton points out, helped produce some exquisite specimens of love poems. So it's because of this crisis, personal crisis, that he was able to produce wonderful love poems. And they had brilliant intensity, as you can see later on. And secondly, his gradual progress towards developing a religious career. As I said, that he was appointed the preacher, and then he was appointed the Dean of St. Paul's Church. Now, this development of a religious career and the death of his wife, this actually shows that he gradually comes to be torn between bleak isolation and the complexities of spiritual crisis. The spiritual crisis actually never left him. That's why you will find that his holy sonnets are written in a very different way. There is a note of anxiety, there's a note of argument, there is a note of self-infliction. All of these are there in the holy sonnets. Now let us get back to, now let us come forward for the central point. First of all, the term metaphysical. I told you perhaps in the very beginning of this, of the lecture on the earlier date, that the word metaphysical or physical, whatever it is, has come from the Greek word physis, Phusis. Physis means nature. And it's from physis that we have got the physics, Padarthavidya, the nature of elements, and we have also the philosophical concept of metaphysical, though it is used in a pejorative sense here. Now, it is in 1630 that William Drummond of Hotherton. Now, William Drummond of Hotherton was a Scottish poet, and in an undated letter to Dr. Arthur Johnston, he points out his objections to different kinds of innovations in poetry and used the term metaphysical. So the first use of the term appears in a letter written to Dr. Arthur Johnston, and the letter was written by William Drummond of Hotherton. William Drummond of Hotherton was a Scottish poet, and he used the term metaphysical in order to show his objections to innovations in poetry. So therefore, the innovations are beyond the physical, beyond our proper perception. That's why he calls it metaphysical. Right. Now, I quote some lines from William Drummond. He says, "In vain have some men of late, transformers of everything." Nowadays, there are some men, these people try to transform everything. In vain have some men of late, transformers of everything, consulted upon her reformation and endeavored to abstract her to metaphysical ideas and scholastical quiddities. Scholastical quiddities. Jyotil, scholastic quiddities. So, therefore, two things are associated. One is metaphysical ideas, something that we call explanation, something that goes beyond our explanation, and something which is extremely complex as characteristic of the medieval scholastic philosophy. This is a very strong commentary as well as a very strong criticism of innovations in poetry. And then Dryden. Dryden uses it in a strictly literary context. He wrote an essay, very famous essay, and anybody interested in learning about English satire must read this essay. The title of the essay is Discourse Concerning the Original and Progress of Satire. I remember that when I used to study in my student days, Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel, we had to compulsorily read this essay first, then read the poem. Discourse Concerning the Original and Progress of Satire. Now, Dryden talks about John Donne. He says that John Donne, there's a very famous passage, affects metaphysics. Affects metaphysics. Affects, what does it mean? Affect actually is a different kind of term here. Affect is a philosophical term. Affective philosophy, a kind of philosophy that shows the emotional response, that is affective. So therefore it affects metaphysics. That means it gets involved with metaphysics, where nature only should reign. In this, Mr. Cowley has copied him to a point. This also shows that it's not a very favorable kind of response. Then comes the very famous Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, in his Life of Cowley, which was written in 1779, he talks about a race of writers. Now, what do we get out of this? We get the development of a genre. First of all, we find Drummond of Huddenden. Drummond simply refers to a sporadic tendency. He refers to, number one, the sporadic tendency. And secondly, we find John Donne. As I was telling you, Hoddenden's idea is that there is a kind of prevalent tendency, and John Donne particularizes it. He identifies them. He simply identifies them and tries to give us a simplified view of what they are trying to do. And finally, Dr. Johnson, when he uses the phrase a race of writers, he is creating a genre. He is referring to a kind of tradition that is evolving now. Although he doesn't approve of it. Why not? I'll tell you later. So he says that in the early decades of the 17th centuries, a race of writers developed that may be termed as metaphysical poets. So it's a genre. Although we ascribe the credit of coining this to Dryden and Johnson, actually the term metaphysical continued to appear sporadically in the critical writings of the entire period. So we just refer to these three people, but there have been many, many such. I am referring to an essay written by Arthur J. Nethercote. Arthur J. Nethercote actually wrote an essay, and the title of the essay is The Term Metaphysical Poets Before Johnson. The Term Metaphysical Poets Before Johnson. It was published in MLN, meaning Modern Language Notes, and there he points out that the metaphysical as a distinctive style of genre was not outside the domain of common discourse. Nethercote mentions Leonard Wellsted. The title of the essay is Dissertation Concerning the Perfection of English Language, published in 1724. Then John Oldmixon. We have all forgotten Oldmixon, but Oldmixon was a very prominent person in the literary world of the time. So John Oldmixon writes Art of Logic and Rhetoric. Then again, Elijah Fenton, Observation on some of Mr. Waller's poems. Then Joseph Warton later on in the 18th century, Essay in the Writings and Genius of Pope. So everywhere they were all talking about, even before Dr. Johnson. And therefore Nethercote asserts the field then, it will be admitted, had been pretty well prepared when in 1778 Dr. Johnson set his pen to paper. So Dr. Johnson was just substantiating the common view that was popular. So that's why sometimes we are asking students to name the persons who are, who created the term metaphysical. And normally we actually, very briefly, we talk about Drummond of Hoddenden, then John Dryden, then Dr. Johnson, but that is not really true. There are some others and very important ones also. And Dr. Johnson actually was synthesizing the whole thing, right? So this is one side, and then, in fact, it is the metaphysical actually was trying to mark a break with the traditional conventions of English poetry. You know that it was a change. But, well, first of all, let me make brief comments on Dr. Johnson. Why did Dr. Johnson go so much against the metaphysicals? Why? Actually, you know, everywhere the history and tradition of poetry is associated with the theological and philosophical critiquing of that particular period. Some days back, I was reading an old book. It was written by Hardin Craig, Hardin, Hardin Craig, Craig. Hardin Craig's The Enchanted Glass. It's a presentation of the Elizabethan mind. Now there, Hardin Craig points out that in order to understand an age, we have to understand the cosmological philosophy, the cosmological science. Otherwise, it is useless to read the age. Otherwise, it is useless to read the texts, because texts tell us nothing if we don't have a proper understanding of the period. So that's why did Dr. Johnson criticize the metaphysicals? They were writing good poems and they were writing well. Then why? Because two things. Number one, Dr. Johnson failed to understand the shifting terrains of thought, the changing nature of thoughts and perceptions against which they were writing. I have talked about such changes in my earlier class. There I have tried to show how politics changed, how philosophy changed, how science changed, everything changed. And therefore, metaphysical poetry is a reflection or is part of that change. But when Dr. Johnson is writing, there's no more change. English society after Charles II has been stabilized. It is now the sense of order that is prevailing in the 18th century society after Charles II. So therefore, after Charles II, during the reign of Queen Anne, etc., now therefore you can see, and William Mary, etc. So all of these reigns were stable, stable forms of society. But that's why Dr. Johnson could not properly understand the nature of shift, the critical and philosophical shift of that time, which was being reflected, however simply, however small, but which was being reflected in the poems. That Dr. Johnson could not properly understand, number one. And number two, the most interesting problem is that the critical theorization or critical tenets, poetical tenets, have radically changed by that time. It is the gradual transition from the world of wit to the world of correctness. So that means it's a shift from Dryden and the metaphysicals to the world of Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson. So that's why the critical thesis, which is acceptable for Dr. Johnson, does not match with the critical paradigm under which the metaphysicals have been working. So he failed to understand. That's why everywhere you will find that Dr. Johnson actually cannot accept such poets, the earlier poets, because they don't match with the critical tenets of his own time. So, this actually is the real problem. That's why we can see that the old philosophy, the medieval scholastic absolutism, everything actually changed. And therefore, it replaced. The Elizabethan A.O. Lovejoy actually wrote a very wonderful essay A.O. Lovejoy, Lovejoy. A.O. Lovejoy actually talked about the Elizabethan period as an age of opulence, as an age of opulence, right? So it's the idea of copiousness, prachurjo, যাকে বলে, copiousness, opulence. That actually marks that period, right? And in the 17th century, especially by the end of 16th century, we find that this kind of view gradually begins to crumble down. So the new philosophy, the new science, the rise of empirical observation, etc., actually brought about changes. And I always think the metaphysicals actually as a reflection of that spirit of change. So therefore, the development of the metaphysical ideal should be studied in the context of a practice of moving away from the earlier schools of thought. Even if they are taking over the earlier schools of thought, like Plato, Aristotle, and others, you will see that they are trying to interpret it in their own way. I'll show it. So therefore, Darn, Marvel, Harvard, whoever, everyone is trying to show that spirit of change. As a result of that, the metaphysical poetry is a triumph of the struggle of ideas. It's a triumph of syllogistic assumptions. It's a triumph of or celebration of the spirit of inquiry, right? So the struggle of ideas, the syllogistic assumptions, the emphasis on inquiry, all of these create a new kind of poetic genre called metaphysical poetry. And I will also try to briefly talk about the wit and conceit. Now, what is the meaning of wit? You know, in the Elizabethan period, I'm forgetting the name of the writer. In fact, you know, in the Elizabethan period, there had been a system of trivia. It's a school, grammar school, ইত্যাদি, যে তখনকার বাচ্চারা যেখানে পড়তে যেত সেগুলোকে বলা হতো ট্রিভিয়াম অথবা কোয়াড্রিভিয়াম। ট্রিভিয়াম মানে তাতে 3টে বিষয় পড়ানো হবে, কোয়াড্রিভিয়াম মানে তাতে 4টে বিষয় পড়ানো হবে। The most popular was the trivium. And what were the things that they used to be taught there? Wit, rhetoric, and logic. And in quadrivium, wit, rhetoric, logic, and mathematics. Such schools actually had a very important classical tradition. আমরা হরেসের লাইফ, হরেসের নাম আমরা সবাই শুনেছি. Horace is a very famous poet. Horace used to go to a school where the schoolmaster was a flogging schoolmaster. সারাদিন বেতের উপর রাখতো সবাইকে, and they used to study such things: literature, wit, logic, mathematics, geography. So in fact, you know, wit actually came to play a very important role in the metaphysical school of poetry, we know, but wit was a special kind of training. Wit কথাটার মানে কি? Wit means objective speech. It actually very simply said, খুব সোজা বাংলায় বললে, it is objective speech. As Alexander Pope much later said, what oft was thought but never so well expressed, etc. যে আগে এত সুন্দর ভাবাও কি ভেবেছি আমরা, কিন্তু বলতে পারিনি ঠিক তেমন ভাবে। এটা হচ্ছে বলার একটা কাজ। That's why it's not only objective speech, it is also inventive speech. That's why in Latin the word for it is ingenuum, INGENU. Ingenu মানে ingenuity. So therefore we find that it is the idea of ingenuum that actually plays a very important part in wheat. Now, we know that the metaphysical period, the time of the metaphysical period, was a time of change and innovation. It was a change of philosophical determinism. It was a change of the Cartesian school of mathematical philosophy. Cartesian কথার মানে হচ্ছে French philosopher Descartes, DESCARTES, Descartes. তারই adjective হচ্ছে Cartesian ইংরেজিতে। So therefore the Cartesian school of mathematical philosophy, these actually led to the demand for economy and precision in the style of writing. I did not find much time, but I should have told you that there was a great rise of mathematics in every field. That was also a part of the constant, developments in the philosophical field. সবই তখন ফিলসফির আন্ডারে। ফিলসফি আজকে আমরা যেমনটি ভাবি তার থেকে অনেক অনেক বড় ছিল সেই যুগের ফিলসফি। However, I'm not going into much details about this. Yes, now I have got the name of the book. This is W.G. Crane. এই বইটা এখন easily পাওয়া যায়, I believe. It was written long back, but a classic work. It is Wit and Rhetoric in Renaissance. Here we find that there was evidently an emphasis on rhetoric and wit as a process of ornamentation and amplification. And they were the Renaissance as well as the 17th century were very much influenced by two books. Number one was Cicero's De Oratore. De Oratore, orator, De Oratore, of oratory. DED, Oratore, ORATORE, De Oratore, written by Cicero. And the other was Plato's concept of euphoria, right? That is found in Republic and Phaedrus, right? So these were the roots, and at the same time it was supported by Aristotle, not poetics, but Aristotle's rhetoric. So therefore we can see that there were three distinctive sources for the development of wheat in the 17th century, as of course 16th century including. So one was Cicero, another was Plato, and finally Aristotle. So therefore this idea of wheat that came to be first synthesized by John Lilly. Lilly's very famous book, Euphues, right? The Anatomy of Wheat. And that was published in 1578, and later on in 1580, another book, Euphues, is England. So these books actually came to create an idea that poetry is not just spontaneous. Poetry is also innovative. It is actually an innovative expression of thought, right? So Samuel Johnson, what does he write? He says the metaphysical poets were men of learning. You understand this? Men of learning. Otherwise, they cannot write about this. They were first condition men of learning. And to show their learning was their whole endeavor. He criticizes that. But actually, this shows the change. This shows the change. We begin to understand that poetry is not just spontaneous. Anybody cannot be a poet. In order to be a poet in the 17th century, you have to be a learned man, which later came to be very, very much strengthened in the 20th century. It is perhaps because of this that T.S. Eliot came all out to support the metaphysicals. So therefore, their thoughts, again, Dr. Johnson says, their thoughts are often new, but seldom natural. He calls them artificial. They are new thoughts, but they are artificial thoughts. They are not obvious, but neither are they just. It's not obvious. That means just read their concepts. It's not obvious. You will have to examine it in order to get to the meaning. And if you want to appreciate that, then you have to learn it. Otherwise, you cannot really get into the core of things. This is how he criticizes them, but this is where we can understand their speciality. He further continues with his remark. He says, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by balance together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. So therefore, he says that heterogeneous ideas are packed together artificially. That's why he says that it is yoked together by balance. But just consider two things. He uses nature and art are ransacked. This is he actually very cleverly indicates a specific point of debate which has been continuing from the first century. Why first century? From the time of Socrates. What is poetry? Is it arts or physis? Arts means art, or physis means nature. What is the producing capacity? What is the originating point of poetry? Is it nature or is it art? Nature means spontaneous genius. Nature means the genius of the poet. He says that this refers to nature and art are ransacked. That means they try to combine, as Horace did in his Ars Poetica. Horace says that there are some who think that poetry originates because of genius, nature. At the same time, there are some who think that it is the production of arts. But Horace says that actually it is the combination of both. And Dr. Johnson unknowingly praises the metaphysicals who are combining this Horatian advice, combining nature and art in accordance with the Horatian advice. So therefore, Johnson actually is right when he says that they combine heterogeneous ideas. That means multiple ideas. But what he fails to say is that they create also a fusion of ideas in order to create a unifying pattern. Apparently, it seems that it is very, very disparate. T.S. Eliot much later uses the term dissociation of sensibility in order to offer a handsome tribute to the achievements of the metaphysical poets. He means to suggest that the metaphysical poets could fuse their intellection with their emotive perception. the intellection and the emotion, the intellective and the emotive are fused in a special kind of poetry, that is metaphysical poetry. So he laments that this creative fusion, so deftly worked out by the metaphysical poets, gradually began to disappear. This fusion is what is needed. The intellective and the emotive, they should go hand in hand. They should be fused. But in the later tradition, they come to be separate. As a result, the romantics say that they are only for the emotive, not for the intellective. The 18th century says that they are for the intellective, not for the emotive. But it was the work of the metaphysicals who tried to combine the intellective and the emotive. It is in this way that they were great, but they were not appreciated by their contemporaries, because they could not discover the rare kind of combination. So Johnson actually wanted to show that it is heterogeneous, but the heterogeneity comes to be fused. Now, as a witty poet, John's chief achievement was, as we all know, the use of conceits. Dr. Johnson's criticism of the conceits was really very cruel. He said that, well, they broke down the Elizabethan principle, the Concordia discourse, unity in diversity. They rather brought in another thing, that is discordia concourse, diversity in everything, diversity in unity. They could not unify. That's why he uses such phrases as dissimilar images, occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. That means they could not understand the meaning. Dr. Johnson could not understand this idea of the conceit. Actually, it is through the conceit that Donne was able to combine the intellective and the emotive. That's what he was trying to do. You will see that while you read the poem. And that's why he found that images are dissimilar, disparate. That's why he says unlike objects are put together to make a sort of sense of likeness, but he could not understand. Right. Now, I will refer to Francis Austin. He wrote a book called The Language of Metaphysical Poets, and there he says that conceits work in conjunction with different kinds of epigrams and other kinds of usages, as it was done earlier by Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, and other Elizabethan poets. That's why he also says they appeared in every form of art, particularly the visual art, from architecture to embroidery. So conceit was not anything new. It was there. Raymond MacDonald wrote an essay called The Lyrical Conceit of the Elizabethans. Here, he debates on various critical assessments on the nature of conceit and arrives at sustainable definition of conceit. What is that definition? He says, a conceit is the elaboration of a verbal or an imaginative figure, or the substitution of a logical for an imaginative figure, with so considerable a use of an intellectual process to take precedence at least for the moment, of the normal poetic process. So the poetic process and the intellectual process. The process of evolving a concept depends on, I'll give you 4 points. How to evolve a concept depends on the discovery of similarity between objects apparently dissimilar. Similarity, discovering similarity among dissimilar things. And it involves, number 2, varying degrees of intellection to identify the nature of similarity. But how to identify that nature of similarity? That involves a degree of intellection. And number 3, it therefore requires a complex amplification of dissimilar patterns of thought. In the Elizabethan and 17th century, amplification was a very, very important literary rhetoric, a rhetorical figure. It amplifies. There is a, how would they teach in the class in their own time? I have read a very wonderful account of that from an old Elizabethan writing. There he says, the teacher is saying, how to teach best amplification. So the teacher says, well, the students are there on their stool, and then he says, well, I say man. Now from man, you have to amplify good man, bad man. Then again, good man, virtuous man, pious man, religious man. Bad man, wicked man, villainous man, then lusty man. Then further, in this way, it becomes a tree, huge tree of amplification. And most of the poets have been following this process of amplification. So ultimately we can say that metaphysical poetry is nothing but an intellectual adventure. It's an intellectual adventure into ascertaining the nucleus of meaning. This is what I can see. So, in order to understand the nature of conceit, I can refer to Donne's The Flea, which is not there normally. In our own time, when we were students in Calcutta University, we had no selection of poems. Our syllabus was done, the metaphysical poets, within bracket, edited by Helen Gardner, and colon, Donne, Marble, etc. Charjan Kobi. That was our syllabus. We had to read the whole. However, so I can refer to Donne's Flea, where he visualizes a complex process of union to the flea, which has bitten both the lover and the beloved. This results in the poet's discovery of their love's totality of union through the flea. So the flea acts as an agent. তাই মশামাছি কামড়ানোর মধ্য দিয়েও দেখা যাচ্ছে একাত্ম বোধ করা যাচ্ছে. He therefore imagines the flea as representing their united self. I'm quoting some lines. Oh, stay, there lives in one flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than one, married are. The flea is you and I and this. Our marriage bed and our marriage temple is. So Donne's complex use of the conceit is also evident in a valediction forbidding weeping, valediction of weeping, which may be, so Donne's complex use of conceit, I am referring to the poem Valediction of Weeping. Again, this poem is an intellective extravagance on their love, which elaborates on the tears that the lover sheds before the beloved. So the lover sheds tears before the beloved. This is the essential situation. But done very curiously shows that the tears being shed reflect and bear the stamp of the face of the beloved. The face of the beloved is reflected on the tear drops. So therefore it becomes stamped with the face of the beloved. Compared to the valuable coins being stamped with the kings or the queens. স্বর্ণমুদ্রাতে যেমন রাজার মাথা বা রানীর মাথা স্ট্যাম্প হয়ে থাকে, তেমনি তো হয়ে গেল চোখের জল। কাজে চোখের জলও সেই রকমই মূল্যবান। So he says this comparison between the tears and the coins stamped in the mint escalates the worthiness of their lover. It's no longer just the tears, the drops of tear, but these are coins, valuable coins. So I'm reading, for thy face coins them, and thy stamp they bear, and by this mintage they are something worth. So therefore there are so many others. For instance, a valediction forbidding mourning, where the legs of a compass are compared to the lovers. So therefore the legs of compass, যতই টানি না কেন দুটো পা যতই দূরে যাক সোজাও হয়ে যেতে পারে, but they are united at one central point. So are the lovers. So that's how we can see that the emotive and the intellective are so wonderfully joined. Right? This is what Dr. Johnson did in his own time. Now, let me go for some of the poems. এখানকার সিলেবাসে আমাদের সিলেবাসে কি আছে বাঁকুড়াতে? সানরাইজিং না গুড মর্নিং?
সানরাইজিং আছে।
সানরাইজিং
in UG syllabus sunrising,
আচ্ছা,
and in PG there is canonization.
কি হলো নতুন কি হলো বাবাটা বুঝলাম?
Canonization in PG.
ও আচ্ছা, না আমি আন্ডার গ্রাজুয়েটেই ধরছি।
ঠিক আছে স্যার,
পিজির জন্য আবার আলাদা করে করতে পারবো আশা করি আলাদা। আচ্ছা, আমি আরেকটা কবিতাও একটু পড়িয়ে নেব ছোট্ট করে, জানি না কত সময় পাবো। একটু পরে আমি উঠবো, উঠে একটু সই করে দিয়ে আসবো, কয়েকটা আমার ডকুমেন্টস এসে গেছে ইউনিভার্সিটি থেকে, সই করতে হবে, তারপর আবার দেখবো। আচ্ছা, গুরুমানব কবিতাটা আমি জানি না কেউ পড়েছে কিনা, নিশ্চয়ই অনেকেই পড়েছেন, ছাত্ররা কেউ পড়েছে পড়েছেন না পড়েছে। যাই হোক, আমি একটা জিনিস বলি যে when we read these poems we find that it is to use a word in the 17th century connotation, that is artifice. তার থেকে আর্টিফিশিয়াল, আর্টিফিশিয়াল কথাটার মানে কিন্তু আমরা এখন যা বুঝি তা নয়। চার্লস ল্যাম্ব একটা এসে লিখেছিল আর্টিফিশিয়াল কমেডি অফ দ্য লাস্ট সেঞ্চুরি। তার মানে কিন্তু কৃত্রিম কমেডি নয়। Artificial refers to something which is based on strict art, artifice, right? It is this sense of artifice that governs the entire structure of the poem. যেমন গুড মর্নিং কবিতাটা যদি পড়া যায়, আমি জাস্ট ব্রিফলি বলে দেবো, তার বেশি যাবো না। সেটা হচ্ছে যে it talks about the awakening into a world of love. Yes, suddenly is an awakening into the world of love. But how do they awaken? It is not a spontaneous, etc. It's an intellective awakening. That's why it begins with 4 interrogations. 4 interrogations. অনেকগুলো জিজ্ঞাসা. And then the answer. The interrogations are again full of different kinds of imagery. The childish imagery of weaning, sucking into the mother's milk, and the Christian myth. All of these are combined. And it concludes with a Platonic tradition. So that's why, as I said, I just began with this in order to show that it is the poem of artifice. It is a poem of artifice which combines the interplay of intellection and emotion. Both of them have a wonderful kind of interplay within the given structure of a poem. Right. So therefore, the poem, in fact, is a structure which is governed by a sense of artifice. And what is that artifice? The artifice is the combination of intellection and emotion. Now, the sun rising. Let me begin with this. The sun rising, as you can see, it begins with, as I said, as we can see, it's always a dramatic and abrupt and colloquial beginning. Most of the metaphysical poems actually bring us straight into the subject without any kind of, introduction. So therefore, the abruptness, therefore the dramatic nature, and the colloquialism. These are very intensely created by them. That's why, busy old fool, unruly son, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Yes, and much to thy motion loved seasons run. প্রথমেই তাহলে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যেটা, there is a distinctive emphasis on this abruptness, sudden beginning, sudden abrupt beginning with a distinctive dramatic sense and colloquialism, right? So that's why he uses in the very beginning 2 interrogations. Why are you doing all this, you old busy fool, you unruly son? Why are you doing all this, disturbing us in our lover's bed? You are calling on us, meaning you are disturbing us. Why are you doing this? And do you think that our season will run in accordance with yours? So there is a sense of chiding. Therefore, it creates an occasion for argument. Why does he do this? Because the poem ultimately will now start with an argument. So a series of argument, the situational reference will be suspended. That's why the situation has got no meaning. We understand the situation. It's morning, the lovers are in their bed, and the sun is there, the sunlight is there in the room. And then begins the sudden colloquial beginning. So therefore, the poem has a double purpose, right? So it begins with a statement of admonition, and this sense of admonition is marked by protestation and defiance. Protestation and defiance. And therefore, let us consider the double purpose. First of all, it's a proclamation on the triumph of love. That's why he says, much to thy motions, lover's seasons run. So lover's season is something unique. It's much beyond your scope. Now, it is something which challenges the Elizabethan cosmology. কিভাবে চ্যালেঞ্জটা হচ্ছে? Now, মনে পড়ছে না, বোধহয় প্রথম দিনে বইয়ে বলেছি, there was the concept of nature. Did I talk about this? নেচারের কথা কিছু বলেছি? Nature, wit, correctness. Wit তো বললাম. Did I talk about nature? বলেছি? কারণ মনে আছে?
So in brief, you have touched upon the.
Briefly. Okay. Nature actually has got in the yes, I remember now. I talked about it, but very briefly. Nature is not the romantic nature. Nature is a technical term. Nature means in the Elizabethan, in the 17th, in the 18th critical terminology, nature means order, symmetry, perfection. Order, symmetry, perfection. That is nature. And therefore, they used to consider nature from three distinctive standpoints. It is the highest form of appropriateness, which is absolute, which is imagined by Plato in the Republic as eidos, E-I-D-O-S, something that is without change, something which has no disturbance or discrepancy, which is truth, the world of truth, aletheia in Greek language, shatya. So therefore, that is one level of nature. And the second level of nature is the world of planets, the perfect movement of planets, the perfect movement of the seasons, the perfect movement of the day, of the course of day and night. So this is also another nature, nature which symbolizes perfection, symmetry, etc. So here, he challenges the macrocosmic order, symmetry represented by nature, which is sun. So he said, must to thy motions, lovers, seasons run. So the cycle of seasons has an order. The course of day and night has an order. So everything has an order. And that is the absolutist principle of the scholastic philosophy. Right? তার বিরুদ্ধে দাঁড়িয়ে বলছি যে lovers season is different. It challenges your order. You can understand the shift. It challenges the medieval scholastic philosophy. That's why I said that apparently it seems that it is a lover's protestation, but that situation is just minimum. After this, it becomes an occasion for argumentative elaboration. Right. So in this way, we find that on the one hand, it is the triumph of love, and on the other, it is an impudent statement on the son's misplaced concern with harm. So that's why we find that she disapproves of the intrusion of the sun. So there are two contrapuntal domains created: the domain of nature and the domain of lovers. So one is the macrocosmic domain represented by the sun, that is nature, and another is the microcosmic domain of mankind, the domain of lovers. So that's why he considers themselves, the lovers, as a class apart, largely distanced from the sun. That's why he said that the sun, the nature, they should rather be busy with the order, with others. It refers to the sense of order. It refers to the, as Virgil, much earlier in his epic, Aeneid, said that humanity is governed by two things. Number one is pietas, P-I-E-T-A-S, যার ইংরেজি করলে মানে দাঁড়ায় পাইটি, কিন্তু তার মানে হচ্ছে order. Pietas and furor. Furor মানে দাঁড়ায় fury, কিন্তু আসলে disorder. So it is order and disorder, right? So he, in fact, tries to suggest that this sense of order, because it challenges the medieval scholastic absolutist axiomatic philosophy, যে তোমার ওই শৃঙ্খলা, তোমার এই নিয়ম, এগুলো আমাদের কাছে আর চলছে না. It challenges the earlier tradition of Saint Augustine and others, the earlier tradition of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Everything is absolutist. But here he says, well, those orders are only meant for, he says, for the late school boys, the sour apprentice, then the court people. In fact, in this very beginning, he tries to confront, stand against the medieval scholastic philosophy represented by sun. He tries to suggest that the kind of order which is presented by the sun should not go with the kind of order represented by the lovers. That means the domain of nature and the domain of humanity are absolutely different, right? So on the one hand, there is the macrocosmic level of order, the macrocosmic level of order represented by nature, the cycle of seasons, the course of day and night, etc. And the microcosmic level is represented by humanity, by man. He says that this order, which was supported by the medieval scholastic philosophy, that is not meant for us now anymore. I have told you that in the 17th century there was a shift, because they wanted to move away from the earlier medieval scholastic philosophy, stressing the sense of order, etc. কাজেই তারা বলছেন, এই ডান সেজন্য বলছেন যে, well, let that order be for the school boys, for the apprentices, for the courtiers, and the people who want to join the king, etc. Right? Not for us. It is in this way that he tries to show that this kind of macrocosmic order of nature, this kind of absolutist axiomatic principle of nature, supported by medieval scholastic philosophy, are no longer acceptable to the metaphysical school of poets. So that's why they reject it. The second stanza further affirms the comparative superiority. He therefore asserts that he can eclipse the sun just by closing the eyes. You'll not see, and the sun is not there. So he says, he can eclipse the sun by just closing his eyes, but he will not do so, because in that case he will lose sight of his beloved. So this is why he chooses to allow him into the room, so as to enable him to realize the nature of their oneness. So he allows the sun. So it's not that the sun is entering. He is allowing the sun to enter their bedroom to see, to inspect their unique oneness. Right. So that's why he writes, ask for those kings whom thou sawest yesterday, and thou shalt hear all here in one bed lay. That means it is just a bed, and the bed is the world. That means even the microcosm becomes the macrocosm because of the unique quality of their love, which transforms everything. So it is the transformative quality of love that has transformed a microcosmic studentদের বলছি, মানে little world of man, or macrocosmic হচ্ছে the unending, the unlimited world. Right? So it is the bed that becomes, it is a microcosm. The little bed is the microcosm. That becomes the macrocosm for them. So therefore, the final stanza is a celebration of their all-engulfing love. He actually makes a bold, hyperbolical statement on the grandeur of their love. So he says that the lover actually iconizes the princess. He says, she is all states and all princess I. Nothing else is. Consider the nature of speciality, how he uses it. The woman and the man. Now the woman is imaged as a space, the state, all states, and the lover is the governor, is the prince. So therefore you can see he's creating a new kind of conceit, a new kind of conceit. So therefore she is all states. She refers to the entire space of the world, and I refer to, I am the governor, I'm the prince. So the governor and the state, governor and the space, this new relationship emerges. So therefore, at the same time, I would refer to another point, this little bed. This little bed is actually acts as the center and the walls. So therefore, the little bed acts as the center, and the walls form the sphere. So the little bed is the center of this world, and the walls actually refer to the sphere. Now here, that's why he says shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. যদি এই আমাদের এই ঘরের মধ্যে সূর্য কিরণ দাও, তাহলে সারা পৃথিবীর আলো দেওয়া হয়ে যাবে। Because this is the word. He says the idea of the room becomes an everywhere. The idea of the room becomes an everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. Now, I would refer to the Platonic philosophy here. এই যে bed, the sphere, etc. বলা হলো bed is the center, আর ঘর চারপাশে দেয়াল সেটা হচ্ছে তাদের sphere. Now, if you read Plato's book Symposium, in Symposium there is a debate. Symposium প্লেটোর লেখা, তাতে দেখাচ্ছে যে সন্ধ্যেবেলায় বড় বড় সব লোকজনরা এসেছেন, এসে প্রেম কাকে বলে তাই নিয়ে নানা আলোচনা হচ্ছে। They are discussing love, but it becomes a philosophical debate. Now they begin to discuss, at one point they begin to discuss the origin of man and woman. This story of the origin of man and woman is very different from the story of the Old Testament. Old Testament story of Adam and Eve. It's a very different story. It is told by Aristophanes. Aristophanes একজন ছাত্রদের জন্য বলছি। Aristophanes was a comic playwright, Greek comic playwright. Now Aristophanes tells a story. Aristophanes says that according to our myth, God first created a sphere, a বর্তুলাকার. A sphere was created, and that sphere represented the man and the woman together. The sphere actually was the being. Jibon was the being that consisted of man and woman both. Now, as the man and woman were together all time, they were very happy with each other, because there was no separation. As a result, God found that this sphere, that means the man and woman together, they never now remember him. They never remember God. So God thought that, well, as I created them happy, they never think that they should think about me. They never remember me. So let me cut this sphere into two hemispheres. You will always find this concept of sphere and hemisphere in dance poetry. Because of this, you can see the crisis. Dance's own personal crisis also, comes up through this. So therefore, we find that God created, according to Aristophanes, God created the sphere. They were very happy. They never used to remember God. So God cut them into two hemispheres. The one hemisphere was called man, another hemisphere was called woman. Now they were separated from each other. Now different kinds of crises began to come up. Sometimes jealousy, sometimes anger, and other kinds of problems. So naturally, in moments of crisis, now they began to remember God. That's why man and woman actually try to get close to each other, because they want to realize that happiness of the sphere. This is the story which was created, which was narrated by Aristophanes in Plato's symposium, and this became a very popular idea, and even Shakespeare in his sonnets used it. I showed it somewhere else in one of my essays that I had published. So you can see here that he is trying to show this oneness. So therefore, the bed is the center and the walls the sphere. It is the spirit of oneness. He again and again tries to develop the spirit of oneness through this poem. So this is one, and let me now pass on to another poem, that is Andrew Marvell's. Andrew Marvell কবিতা আছে তো? Andrew Marvell আছে তো honestly?
No, sir. There is no poems of Andrew Marvell in UG syllabus now.
Oh, so therefore, I have fortunately completed my syllabus. I thought that to his coy mistress is also there. It is there somewhere else, perhaps in PG. Postgraduate আছে?
স্যার বর্ধমানে ছিল, বাঁকুড়ায় ওটা নেই।
হ্যাঁ, বর্ধমানে তো ছিলই। আমার কাছে রেডি আছে, কেউ যদি বর্ধমানে কি ইয়েতেও নেই, পোস্ট গ্রাজুয়েটেও নেই?
স্যার পোস্ট গ্রাজুয়েটও মার্কেট নেই।
কয় মিস্ট্রেস নেই, গার্ডেন আছে।
ও গার্ডেন, হ্যাঁ সেটাও ভালো। ওকে, তাহলে এইটুকুই আমি পড়লাম আজকে। আর আমার একটা ইচ্ছে রয়ে গেল, সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমার এখানে বারবারই আমি দেখি যেটা হয় সেটা হচ্ছে যে ছাত্রছাত্রীরা আমাদের যখন ইয়েতে আসে, কলেজ সার্ভিস কমিশনের বিভিন্ন ইন্টারভিউ আসে বা অন্যান্য ইন্টারভিউ আসে, তখন দেখা যায় যে the background problems are there. সেটা অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই অসুবিধে হয়ে দাঁড়ায়। যদি ভবিষ্যতে কোনোদিন সুযোগ হয় তাহলে একদিন আমরা ব্যবস্থা করব। তো যাই হোক, থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ। আমি চেষ্টা করলাম যতটা পারি ছাত্রীদের যদি সুবিধে হয় তাহলে আমার ভালোই লাগবে।